Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Today we will talk about one of the most famous American ships ever to grace the seven seas with its presence. Naturally, I'm talking about the United States frigate Constitution. She was built in 1797 as part of the first 6 frigates ordered for the United States Navy. It was designed specifically for the purposes of fighting the Barbary powers of Northern Africa, which had become a nuisance for American trade, for the ever-expanding American trade at the time. As the whole purpose of the Corso, or the Corsair activities of the pirates, were not just ripping off other people's cargoes and ships, but really it was a slaving operation. The most valuable cargo was not so much what the ship was carrying, but the men who manned the vessels, who operated them. It was the crews, since slave labor was needed in North Africa. To protect American shipping from this, the United States decided to construct a squadron of frigates. As part of the process of designing these frigates, of course, there was a discussion of what kind of vessels should we build. America had inexhaustible reserves of excellent shipbuilding timber, fairly limited size population at the time, but rapidly growing. And a navy, after all, is a means of projecting power. The question was, what kind of power? Are we challenging the other European powers? Are we claiming control of the sea lanes of the world? Or is it something else? Quickly, it was obvious that the fledgling navy does not have the resources to construct a fleet large enough to compete with the great powers of the time, such as, obviously and foremost, Great Britain, France, Spain, among the most obvious candidates for this honor. So, the decision was to build frigates, or to build vessels that would be larger than their class, so that they can outgun and outfight anything in their class. And yet, they'll be fast enough and light enough to escape anything that is bigger, heavier, more powerful, something that they cannot fight off. The concept is neither original nor particularly new. The truth of the matter is that this idea was developed by the Swedish naval architect of Scottish origin, Henrik af Chapman, in the mid-18th century. Strategically speaking, Sweden was encountering very similar circumstances to the fledgling US Navy. They had an extremely evil, extremely aggressive, and extremely powerful and large enemy and neighbor, namely the Muscovian Empire. I will use the true name of the country rather than the invented number of Russia. The expansionism of the Muscovians has been present since the establishment of their principality at the end of the 15th century, and has been a major source of instability in the Eastern and Northern Europe ever since, and as we all know, continues to the present day. In this context, Sweden, which was fairly small, not particularly rich country at the time, had to somehow protect its land. So they developed, or rather Chapman developed, a navy that was capable of dealing with this threat. And surprisingly, not that now and then they lost a naval battle, what is surprising is how many they actually won and how successful they were in keeping Muscovian expansion in check. And for that, Europe owes Sweden big time. Returning to the vessels, Chapman came to the conclusion that the Swedish budget cannot afford to outbuild the Muscovians. There was no question about it. So he created a class of vessels that could serve both as heavy cruisers, frigates, or as small ships of the line, depending on the circumstances. This is the famous class of frigates Bellona. They were 40-gun vessels armed with 24-pounders. During peacetime and when on cruising duty, they could carry 18-pounders and thus not strain the fabric of the vessel. But in wartime, or when they were needed to serve as ships of the line, they could be rearmed with 24-pounders. The Bellona class was highly successful. second time that the idea of extremely large frigates emerges is actually in an English treatise from 1788 known as the Shipbuilder's Repository. It is anonymous, but the detailed description of how shipbuilding is carried out, of all the scantlings, all the dimensions of vessels, including the original treatise came also with folio of drawings of different classes of vessels from this period. So clearly it is emerging from the dockyards. It is talking only about naval vessels. It is part of the dockyard emergence. In that treatise, in describing the different classes of vessels that are built for the Royal Navy and that are proposed to be built, the anonymous author argues that it is time to get rid of the 44-gun two-decker frigates that have existed since at least the turn of the 18th century, and to be substituted with single-deck, much longer, much larger, but also much faster 44-gun frigates that will carry also 24-pounders as their main armament. And the idea behind it is exactly this. Such frigates would be way faster than anything that is stronger than they are, and at the same time will be much more powerful warship than anything that could possibly compete with them in speed. The length on deck of such vessels was supposed to be around 165 to 168 feet, which is remarkably close to the American 44-gun frigates. It is less than 10 feet apart, the two vessels. At the time, the Royal Navy did not start building them. It would take some time before they adopted it because the cost of such a frigate is much higher. When you're building a few frigates of the class, always good. You can afford an expensive vessel. But when you need numbers to cover pretty much all the stations in the world that you need to send your cruisers to and to control, then of course you need something that will be adequately strong vessel, but at the same time would be much cheaper to construct in large numbers. The 44-gun frigate was not cheap to build. The United States could afford to build them because we had small numbers. And here we are entering one interesting question that has exercised naval historians and maritime ship historians for probably 100+ years by now. Namely, who designed the American frigates? It has been suggested, and most vehement patriots insist that that is the case, that the design belonged to Humphreys, a well-known shipbuilder of great repute based in Philadelphia, that he designed the vessels and from there distributed to the different places where they would be built. The other wing suggests, somewhat coyly, that perhaps after all we should look for the design of the vessels, or for much stronger impact on the design of the vessels, from Josiah Fox. Josiah Fox was an émigré who had trained in the Royal Dockyards in England and came to the United States after the American Revolutionary War. He made his way into the shipbuilding industry in America. He certainly, that part is unquestionable, he's the one who drew the final plans for the Constitution class 44-gun frigates. The issue really is whether he was only a draftsman or did he have more active design role in the process. Considering that he was classically trained in the dockyard at about the time when the treatise that I mentioned would have been written and would have been debated in the dockyards, I am suggesting that Josiah Fox may have had more active role in the final design. This likely we will never know for a fact, but I'm at least open to the thought that Fox may have been more active. Be this as it may, as we know, the frigates were a great success. Another interesting controversy exists on how many 44 frigates were constructed. If you ask Chappell, the Philadelphia frigate, which eventually Stephen Decatur would burn in Tripoli after her capture, was a 44-gun and possibly the fastest of the lot. If you ask other sources, she, however, was only a 36 or a 38. I have seen both figures mentioned. I cannot tell which of the two it is. I have not had access to the archives to chase it down, especially since these vessels are a little bit later than my usual area of specialization. By far the most important and interesting and famous of the lot, of course, is the Constitution herself. She was blooded in the wars against the Barbary pirates around the early years of the 19th century. Her history is way too well known to elaborate upon it. We normally, of course, value her mostly for her few victories during the War of 1812. In the War of 1812, Constitution managed successfully to escape from a British squadron at the very beginning of the war, and subsequently won the actions against Guerrière, an ex-French frigate in Royal Navy service, which was on the way to Halifax to be condemned since she was through and through rotten. Subsequently, she captured in a battle that almost lost the Constitution to us with Java. Luckily for the Constitution, the Javans were not well trained and were not particularly good gunners, so the Constitution got away with a couple of mistakes that her captain made during the action. However, the battle with Java had very important repercussions because it essentially sank the whole idea of the American Secretary for the Navy, his military plans for that year. She was so heavily damaged that she had to return to Boston for repairs. She managed to sneak through the blockade, return to Boston, and would not go back to sea until the beginning of 1815, when she captured two small sloops of war, 9-pounder sloops of war of the British Navy, essentially both of them after the end of the war. She survives to the present day in Boston Harbor. It can be visited. She was extensively repaired in the late 1900s for her bicentennial. She was rebuilt to a look that she actually has never had during her active career. Why the decisions were made to restore her the way they did is beyond me, but I'm sure that the Navy had very good reason behind it, even if they have not deigned to share it with me, strangely enough. As with all wooden warships, and really not only wooden warships, but also steel, during such a long career, many things changed. Her looks changed in many ways throughout the period. And in this respect, this book by Karl-Heinz Marquardt, in the Anatomy of the Ship series, is particularly valuable. The book obviously is targeted specifically at the ship modeling or ship enthusiast community. It goes through the usual history of the vessel, from the construction through its operational history, all the way down to the present days. It has a few photographs here and there of the ship as she is now. And it is also, and in the major part of the book, of course, is dedicated to the drawings of the vessel. Here is an outline of her history. Popularly, she's known in the US Navy as Old Ironsides. If I had $5 for every ship that has been nicknamed Old Ironsides around the world, I think I would be a millionaire. I wouldn't be talking to you right now. I would be having a drink in the Caribbean on an Edwardian classical yacht, sailing yacht. Having, of course, professional crew sail it for me. Or maybe not, since I do enjoy the process myself. So this is an interesting collection of photographs of the vessel from this period, of course, and here are the drawings. There is enough documentation here, enough drawings to allow a model of the vessel to be constructed, but I would like to bring to your attention one very specific set of drawings, and eventually, if you are patient enough to bear with me, I will reach that stage. Here we go. Finally, here are the different versions of the stern of the vessel, as is nowadays, as she was originally, and as she may have been during the War of 1812. Personally, I very much prefer her original look. She would have been far more beautiful vessel in those days than in the War of 1812. And unfortunately, ship modelers always model her as she was during the War of 1812. I have not seen a single model of her in her earlier, far more graceful, far more beautiful and lighter period of construction. To me, this is a pity because a fantastic opportunity is missed to create something original, something unique, something that no one else does. So hopefully somebody will feel inspired to do this. I would like to bring your attention, of course, to another set of drawings, and that is the drawings of the carronades and the slides of the carronades on her quarterdeck as they are nowadays. Because it is somewhat eclectic combination. Here is this type of carronade, the older one, with trunnions rather than a lug under the carronade. It is, of course, a sliding carriage, this is as it should be. But this type is the earlier carronades, around the year 1800, prior to 1805. And right next to them, currently on the vessel, is this type, the later type of carronade. Lug mounted, you see the lug right under the belly of the gun, with the lifting screw at the end, instead of the quoin as is used on this gun. Why on earth the combination of the two has been displayed is beyond my case, because obviously this is the type that she would have carried during her campaigns against the Barbary pirates, or corsairs, use whatever politically correct term you prefer to use. And during the War of 1812, she would have carried this type of carronade. So why a mixture of the two? I probably should hasten to add that most of the guns that she carries nowadays were cast only in the 1930s, if I remember correctly. Be this as it may, this is a well-done book. It is an interesting book. It shows a very important vessel. After all, this is the oldest commissioned naval warship that is afloat. I underline afloat, otherwise, of course, Nelson's Victory would be the oldest commissioned vessel. This book has been addressed and reviewed as from Shipmodeler's point of view in our sister channel, and the link is over here in the corner. So by all means, head there, have a look at it. There, the drawings are shown in much more detail than I'm showing it. And all in all, I think that this is a valuable addition to Shipmodelers and ship enthusiasts library. Thank you very much for your attention. If you liked what you heard, put a like, add questions, comments, throw the proverbial rotten tomatoes and eggs at me, do as you like. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope to see you next time.